talk at this university. Yeah, one of my affiliations in here and in particular with CETE-P, which is a center we do where we connect environmental ethics with technology ethics. So the emphasis is more on environment. Today I will talk about AI and democracy, so it's more in line of what I did last 5 years, emphasizing more the political dimension of thinking about artificial intelligence. Yes. So this talk is based on a book, Why AI Undermines Democracy and What to Do About It. It's a book that really, I think, also speaks to current concerns about both authoritarianism and ways that democracy is coming under threat in a political context. And that's exactly what I was worried about years ago already, that we are in this kind of political environments in the West where we have the rhetoric about democracy, but at the same time tendencies that really go away from democracy. So my concerns about this lie on the basis of global thinking about, like, okay, what is actually AI's impact on democracy and on those sort of negative developments, but also positively, what can we do about it? So that's more the second part. So the research question, if you like, is what is the impact of AI on democracy? How can we make sure that AI supports democracy? This is a research question that I don't have definite answers on. It's ongoing research, but what the book tries to do is to formulate a tentative answer to these questions and to give some introduction and direction where I think that we could go with this. So my actual answer is AI as it's currently developed and used. Use is always very important in philosophy of technology for me. It's not only about those algorithms, objects, data, and so on. It's about what we do with it, how it's used, in what context it's used, and how that undermines fundamental principles and knowledge bases on which our democracy is built. And at the end, and it doesn't going to have to come good, it's something, a normative orientation that I add at the end. And yeah, let me go through the book and through the arguments in different parts to give you some idea of like what kind of political philosophy mainly we can use to think about this research question. The way I will do this is by using non-technical language. I don't like technical language, even talking to other philosophers. I like to use language that, in my mind, is quite accessible to other disciplines. I think interdisciplinary research is really the way to go with thinking about artificial intelligence. So, but of course, feel free afterwards if some terms or phrases are not clear to you. Please don't hesitate to ask. So here, the assumption throughout the talk is what I already put in other books, what I also learned in philosophy of technology, namely that it's not the case that technology can just be used for good or for evil. Technology itself has some tendencies, has some affordances, and based on that, we have to assess its consequences on society, in society. In this case, I went back in the history of AI. Before AI was called AI, there was something like cybernetics. Some of you might know much more about it than I do. But what I liked when I was looking at it is that there was a kind of metaphorical comparison possible here with some philosophy, namely Plato's political philosophy, which says that steering of the ship of the state is a kind of cybernetics. It's something that if you steer a ship, there's all kind of stuff happening in the environment. You have to respond to that, and so that's a kind of cybernetic process. Very interesting in itself, but what Plato explained is a metaphor to say that, well, you don't give the steering of a ship to someone who just doesn't know what he's doing. You give it to an expert who knows how to steer it. And so that sounds right for the ship, but is it right for the state? Is it right for our society? He thought it is right for society. So he had basically an authoritarian, technocratic understanding of how to steer society. He said, like, the guardians have to, those who know how to steer the ship of the state. And we see tendencies today also to do that, partly because it is a technical topic, so experts, of course, are needed in this. I'm the first to admit that or to argue for it. But the question is, how much power do we give these experts? And you see tendencies today that, people from big tech specifically say, like, I'm the expert on this. Please leave AI to us. We'll take care of it. We'll take care also of the ethics, and we also take care of it politically. And it goes so far that today we have people from big tech literally playing roles in American politics. At the time, I could not even imagine that. I thought I imagined quite a lot of bad scenarios, but I never imagined, for example, someone like Musk really taking these roles. But the book kind of, I think, gives some tools to think about it. So, also if we look at the history of technology and democracy in general, we see that often technologies have been used in a way that centralized power. The Egyptians, the kings and the priests accumulated power based on their science and technology of their time. They could predict the agricultural events that are, weather and so on, seasons, sunshine that is important for agriculture. So based on such knowledge, it was very much entangled with the development of actually mathematics and mathematical tools, right? So in a way, you could see that as a sort of proto-history of AI in that sense. But whatever is the case there, you see this centralization of power through the use of science and technology. In the 19th century, to jump very quickly, we see also already the use of big data, the use of statistics to control the population of the state. For example, in France, Michel Foucault in the 60s, 70s has been very critical of these techniques of biopower, as he called it, of techniques of discipline based on statistical data. So in that sense, it's not new what happens here. Now, if we ask the research question, what does AI do to democracy? Of course, we have to define those. And here, there's a lot to learn from you, what you know about AI here at this faculty. But next to these technical elements, algorithms, data, software, hardware, and of course the whole infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, there's a lot to say about how many layers that there are to all this, how many elements, technological elements we need to actually make AI work. And it is very important. There's also a kind of economic and environmental aspect to this. But I'm also interested in how this intersects with the stories we tell about AI, how there are narratives that also shape how AI actually is developed. For example, science fiction has a huge influence on the way people think about AI and even develop AI. For example, the project of developing AGI, artificial general intelligence, also perhaps super intelligence, is inspired by science fiction. So there are narratives in our culture that shape how we think about AI, what we do with AI, how we develop AI. There are all kinds of collective hopes and dreams about the future of humanity that can go into play. So also for humanities people, I think it's really interesting to study this and to also bring that to bear upon the political question. Then democracy is quite a big concept. People often use the term but don't really explain what they mean by it. There are various theories of democracies, various conceptions of democracy. And in the book, I really say, like, yeah, we often, if we hear democracy, we think about voting. And of course, it can be part of democracy. It's an important part of our representative democracies that as citizens we can vote for politicians. But we should not forget that this is a very specific way of thinking about democracy and about politics. That it's not me as a citizen who should talk about what is the common good, for example, or what should we do in society, but that I vote for someone else to talk about that I give the power to that person, and also that my only contribution to all this is going to vote every 4 years, 5 years. So this is a very specific way of thinking about democracy. The older way of thinking about democracy is one that is rooted in a Republican tradition, and where participation in the political process is important. So not representation, but participation. Also deliberation, to think together about what kind of society do we want, what kind of policies do we want. This is not something we do today. Our policies regarding AI, for example, currently are decided largely by the European Commission with a bit of input from the Parliament and some input from national governments. This is not something that you or I have been asked about. It's going on over our heads without us. These older perspectives really that you need to communicate, you need to talk with democracy as a kind of conversation. And figures in that are Habermas, who expressed consensus as goal. This has been questioned of, but it's still an important goal. Art and Dewey talk about this public space, this understanding that we need to get with one another. And so there's a kind of democracy theory that has inspired a book that I then apply to the question of AI. What is also interesting in this kind of what I would call richer, non-instrumental versions of democracy is that my answer to Plato and the answer of Republicanism to Plato is a yes and no. So yes, we actually need knowledge. We need the experts, but no, those experts shouldn't rule by themselves. They should have an input in the democratic process. So this is really important thing to keep in mind with regards to AI. Then I'm very well aware that democracy is a kind of ideal, and of course today it's more, unfortunately, more and more ideal. And that means that there is always this gap that we have to look at these anti-democratic tendencies also. Now, if we then go to look at like what does AI do to democracy, then we can start with the voting. So the voting is indeed something that can be impacted by AI in the sense that AI, in combination with social media, enables this profiling of people, it enables the analysis of all this data, and it also enables then indirectly the manipulation of people, trying to influence people to vote A rather than B. So there is also today, across the political spectrum, use of AI on social media to try to influence voting and vote. So this is definitely happening. Already Cambridge Analytica case 2016, I believe, that's already almost 10 years ago. So you can imagine if it happened then, it happens today too. The media doesn't focus so much on it. Probably it's happening in the background. But in the book, I'm also interested in looking at like what is now the influence of AI also on sort of this richer conception of democracy. And that richer conception is that republicanism with the participation, but also the values and principles that are there also in liberal democracy, not even necessarily Republican, but in the kind of liberal democracies that in the West have been established and justified based on principles of the French Revolution in combination with other principles, for example, tolerance, important rule of law also. And then what you see with AI is that all of this really requires that you make up your own mind as a citizen about politics, that there's nothing or nobody influencing you, that you have this autonomy. But with AI, if there is this manipulating influence, that's no longer the case. So you might think that you have your own political views, but these political views are, first of all, always also influenced by others. That is what social scientists tell us. But I add to that that technology is also really shaping our minds, as we sometimes call it. So these are influences that are there and that undermine these kind of principles, freedom, autonomy, undermine also fraternity and fairness if biases are introduced by AI, for example. And also, if you have a society with large power asymmetries, you can't have any more this idea of, oh, let's talk together about our future. No, what's happening then is that some have so much more power than others, as is in the case of the US, for example, that this kind of democracy of talk among equals is no longer applicable, it's no longer possible. So that's another danger. And then if we say that there's tolerance, listening to one another, trying to understand each other, then it's not great that if you have a social media environment where this is actively discouraged, because it's better for those media companies, for those tech companies, that there is polarization, because they want more engagement, that there is a lot of emotional content and so on. Then, so you create this kind of knowledge sphere that's toxic, and that leads to the next point, where you have a kind of, the question is here, not just what does AI to those basic principles of democracy, but also what does AI do to the knowledge environment that is needed for qualitatively good democracy. So what does a good democracy, according to this rich sense, require? It requires a knowledge base, because this is the Platonic point, right? You need knowledge to steer. So you need also knowledge then among citizens, if you say self-proof, if you say that citizens should prove themselves. And you also need a basic level of social trust and connection. The one way to see why this is important is to look at the absence of this. So if you have a social environment where there's a lot of isolation, as it tends to be in modernity in general, and especially can be as a result also of technologies, and if it's more and more difficult to distinguish truth from untruth, if there's soullessness, all kind of conditions that Hannah Arendt pointed to after the Second World War as being the soil for totalitarianism, well, that's the opposite of democracy, right? So when it comes to analyzing what AI does to democracy, it's good to also look at that knowledge base and that kind of social environment. Like, is there sufficient trust in our society? Is there not too much isolation? Is it still possible to distinguish truth from untruth? Well, then democracy has a chance. If not, it's going to get really difficult. So if we assess technologies like AI in terms of their societal influence and influence to democracy, we need to also look at those conditions. It's clear that through all these influences that I already mentioned, in combination with things like eroding distinction between what is real and fake, and the creation of perceived bubbles, it means that on social media people tend to talk to others who agree with them. Polarization could be added also there, so that you actually are actively creating this kind of toxic, so no basis basically for democracy and this kind of toxic knowledge environment. If you manage to also other political processes, but also with the use of AI to undermine trust in each other, for example, by means of polarization, then you can contribute to these problems. Power asymmetries again, because power asymmetries are based on knowledge asymmetries. If there is no transparency about the technology, then that can be used by those who develop technologies to gain more power. So again, with tech comes scarcity view. And also in the end, I think our self-images and those autonomous subjects, people who think for themselves, people who want to rule themselves, get eroded. We thought in the alignment that we wanted to be like that, but in the meantime, there are all these social technological processes going on that undercut this idea. Here's more on epistemic agency. What I like about this term is that it connects agency with knowledge, right? So that for democracy, you need knowledge, and you also need people who can exercise these critical capacities of questioning their own beliefs, putting their own beliefs on the table to be discussed, so vulnerable, not just saying that I'm right, but just really being open to other views, because the other person might be right. This is very difficult for people to do, but it's actually what we try to do in academia, but also it's helping them. So, epistemic agency is one way to talk about it. I also have a more recent article on this. Then, so in all this is the case, the question is like, how can we improve this? So of course, this already gives some criteria, like, okay, what do we need for improving democracy, and what do we need for if we want to change AI? The challenge is here on two sides. So on the one hand, if democracy is in danger, we can try to make democracy stronger by technological means. We can, for example, create institutions that are more robust against someone coming along trying to grab all the power. Unfortunately, a lot of research in academic world goes into topics that have nothing to do with that, and we still have the same problems like in the 1930s of the previous century. We still have, for example, far-right states with power to majority votes. So how can we do something about that? The political scientists don't have the complete answer to this yet, but more. But then also the question, and this may be something that might be interested in technology, is to can we use AI for democracy? Can we use AI to strengthen actually all these conditions, to support the principles, to make it less likely that all these things happen? So when it comes to different institutions, I think what we could do to make democracy stronger is taking seriously this richer ideal of democracy. Obviously, just this idea of representation and voting doesn't completely work, because it seems incredibly easy to move from democracy to authoritarianism. What we can also do is to not always see only technology as a solution. So some people from big tech, for example, might see AI as the solution for everything. So let AI take over the government, make things more efficient, and so on. It's also not the way to go. Then I think we need probably a new institution or new institutions that can actually do this difficult balancing act. On the one hand, taking Plato seriously and putting this knowledge into democracy, right? So not the anti-intellectual climate that we have in Europe, for example, but taking seriously the knowledge, and on the other hand, still making sure that there is this democratic legitimacy. So what in very concrete terms we need, instead of all these new technologies having some ad hoc committees and ad hoc experts who give their view, what we could do is have permanent institutions where experts, both technical and people such as me maybe, or so on, are connected to the democratically elected bodies and really make sure that there is this flow of expertise into the democratic process. And that means we think kind of politicians, but it also means to our citizens. So these kind of processes need more institutional support and more permanence. So that's why I use this term institution for this. Then also the ownership, right? So I mean, do we really want that tech development is entirely in the hands of private sector, or do we also want to, as a society, say like, yeah, it's so important for society that some of this infrastructure, some of this data, some of these algorithms that they need to be in control of the public. So these are different ways of looking at this. And then also, in addition, this is a hard one, how to deal with this also in a global context, right? So a lot of political philosophy is always about nation states. So a lot of what I've been saying is about that. But what does this mean? How to scale this? It's already difficult to scale from the ancient city-state that the Greeks talked about, where they try to have democracy to the nation-state. But what about global governance? Global governance of AI, global governance of all kind of big problems like climate change and so on. So this is really important, I think. And there's also this surprise that we need to work on. Then the question is, okay, so these were the political institutions, it's very from them, but it can be made, instead of seeing it just as a problem, it can also be a solution. Yes, we can try to intervene at the stage of development as a society, and through regulation, force those who develop AI to take into account the ethical and political consequences. We also, I think, should embed this development in democratic political institutions. So again, trying to make the power of those who develop it less, and to insert this democratic validation process. Also, if we have this more richer ideal of democracy, which is about participation, which is about deliberation, then we could think of like, how could AI actually help with that? So one way it can help is that it can, for example, if we in this group had to agree on a particular policy on AI, it could make clear which are the positions. It could make clusters of different positions in this room. And then it could say like, well, there's overlap between cluster A and C. Maybe you guys can talk to one another. So, of course, in my view, this needs to be all mixed with human interventions, but AI could help actually in larger settings, also online settings, if you want to have a kind of deliberation at national level, for example, if you want to organize that. AI could really help there with figuring out positions, with summarizing, with translating also. Think of big cities that have multilingual for context, but also if we think together about global governance. So there are ways in which AI can help. Even the private sector is interested in this. Google DeepMind, for example, has a Habermas machine, which means AI that helps with getting people to have consensus, to reach consensus. So the process is that participants with written opinions on a given topic needs to be written, of course, as input for the AI, but it could be also all the other different tests. Then the AI generates group statements. So you have all these different viewpoints. These statements can be then rated and critiqued by humans again. And then the system uses this feedback to produce more refined statements. So it's in the end going to a final group statement. So it is kind of trying to automate partly this process that normally human facilitators engage in. But what I like about trying to use AI, especially in combination with humans, is that it can also do things that it can surprise us. It can find overlaps, it can find connections between views, between people that maybe the human facilitator overlooked. So we should also be open here for the opportunities of AI in general, by the way, so not against AI. But of course, these technological solutions are not sufficient. We need humans, we need also humans, I think, that have interdisciplinary knowledge and humans that have a background that helps them to think about their society and future. And for this, we need less recipes, we need humanism, we need enlightenment, we need all this inspiration from the past. So that's again the platonic element. Knowledge needs to be part of the process. Interdisciplinary also, it's still the case that we organize universities generally in disciplinary ways, in spite of the fact that we have all these problems that really need interdisciplinary work. We could change that. Also, we should ask, we're all the time talking about human politics, the democracy of humans, but how to deal with the fact that we now, we shouldn't only talk about humans, we should also talk about climate, we should talk about the planet, we should talk about non-humans like animals, non-human animals, and at least ask the question, like, how can they somehow be part of politics? So all these questions that we asked, in the book I don't put too much emphasis on this, and maybe focus on human politics that needs to be asked. And then finally, I think that it's a weakness of classical liberalism that it tries to be as thin as possible. It says like, we don't need too much shared values and shared normative orientation, but in fact I think we do share, we have to share something, and part of what we need to share is some orientation and interest in the common good. So I think if you really have people who don't care about the common good at all, forget about democracy, right? So I think there needs to be some minimum interest in the common good, and that's again something that can be also further fostered by education. So education is very important here, not only in university, but already starting with parents, kindergarten, and so on. So for this common good, the reason why I say this is that I think the best ideal of democracy I can imagine is one that envisages this kind of communicative processes where people really talk to one another, are open to each other's views, try to understand each other, have empathy for other people's problems, and so on. But it means also that you have to build that. You have to build that common understanding. And partly that means also making sure that people have, in terms of knowledge, a common growth, that they share something. And this is really, I think, partly what's problematic with AI in combination with current digital social media, that we more and more are in our own bubbles, ultimately in our own individual bubble, and that we share less and less. So the less we share, the less we will be willing to talk about common goods, right? So this is really something that we could see as a criterion that AI is technology support rather than when I talk about common good, philosophers have different views on this. What is a common good? So one way to understand it is simply saying that common good means that it needs to be, that whatever it is needs to be publicly owned. So some people think that AI should be something that's part of the commons, that's part of what we together own rather than that it's private. Also some discussions go about like, can we really define what a common good is? Can we define it on beforehand? Or is it something that's more the outcome of procedure? And here I'm more on this procedural side together with you. I say like, well, you can't just, as philosophers, as a kind of Platonic kings, decide about the common good. You need the democratic process, you need first the deliberation. And if you see it as an outcome, it's also less scary again, because some people think like, yeah, the common good, do you want to impose it on others? So no, you don't want it. I think it should be the outcome rather than something to start from. You'll probably need to share something. So this is a tricky question. But I do think that some things need to be shared before you start even the deliberation. So you can't really deliberate if you're so apart from each other that it doesn't work. So here I think some communitarian influence needs to be there on the idea of democracy. And I think that AI, instead of just seeing as a tool of control, potential control, and a danger, can also be seen as a communication tool, as something that can be used to create a community, to create something shared. So if we can somehow, in those algorithms, if we can tweak things in such a way that, within a social media environment, for example, that that is talking to one another, that is creating of common experiences, that this is promoted rather than hindered, then we are on a good way towards more democracy. And so there is again my point that we share common world from Ireland, and it is also like a making. So instead of having a conservative argument that says like we have this tradition and we should all share the same tradition, I think this is no longer possible. But what we can do is that we as citizens also partly make something in common. Right? So instead of just having procedures as a very thin kind of thing that doesn't involve any normative stuff, we can actually try to make something common based on the situation, also, not just something that we find on the vision. And I think that is really important for democracy, because if we don't manage to somehow find this common platform, this shared knowledge and shared kind of interest in a common good, then the way is open for more authoritarianism and totalitarianism. So that's what I hope that AI really can contribute to, rather than hinder. That it can contribute to making this common world, to in this way to make democracy possible. That's which fits into democracy, right?
Great, yeah, thanks, Mark. For the talk. So I got a two-part. First one's sort of like a general question, more about political philosophy, and then the second one is a specific question.
Okay.
So, when you think of democracy, right, you think of like rule of the people. So you think of this sort of populist approach to how we govern ourselves. And I hear the need for expert opinion, right? Look at the COVID pandemic and everything came out of that. We need to make sure that expert opinion is what's driving our decision making, our political decision making. And those two ideas are in some kind of tension. Right? And I imagine your way of getting out of that tension is to pivot to deliberative democracy, something about the deliberative process. Right. But it's not entirely clear to me like how we get out of that tension, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And then the specific question I have is, again, with the expert opinion. One big thing that we see on the totalitarian fascist right is this sort of attack of expert opinion, calling us elites. Right? And then you see that sort of being used by people who go, oh, the elites, the liberal elites. And so can AI help us map this sort of stain on expert opinion? And is the solution more participation that AI can help facilitate?
Okay, thanks for the questions. I think the first one is something that I also don't have a full answer to yet. So what I propose is that we somehow combine this expertise and the democratic process by really having them talking to one another, but on a permanent basis, right? But I'm not sure exactly how to organize it. Is it enough to have a kind of more permanent council of experts that always weighs in on things, or do we need some more creative ways of combining that? I do think that we probably need some more creative ways of doing that. Also toward the general public, right? So we need sort of maybe think about educational process, some kind of civic education, and then also make sure that each time there is a problem that's expertise that can be trusted, somehow, that's sort of epistemically robust, and make sure that it gets to everyone. So I think it's a huge challenge, and I think we need some people who can think more practically to how to do that, to organize that. The second question is a good one. I think also a good one is the elite, right? So that the stain of this elite, and this in a way leads back to Plato's gardens argument. So I think the way to deal with that is not so much AI, but is to make sure that the distribution of power in society is tackled, that the way our democracies work nowadays is still that there is indeed the creation of some elites, often backed by money, so capitalism comes in there too. So I think this raises questions about our socio-economic system, if there are alternatives to capitalism, or also even if we don't want it, how to regulate capitalism in a way that milders these effects, that there isn't this kind of, so that you don't have this popular argument going against them, because there is some truth in this populist criticism. There is some truth. There is some, I think, asymmetry in power. There is this power elite as from the leader from the 50s or 60s calls it. So to take away their ammunition, in a way, we need to do something about how society is organized, how we distribute power and other resources. So I think that's the way to deal with that.